name is David29Sunset, and this is the Kids Popcorn Podcast, where we talk to interesting people about movies they watched as kids and kids' movies they find interesting as adults. For this episode, my guest is Zach Geballe, co-host of the Vine Pair Podcast. Thanks for being here, Zach.
Thank you for having me, David.
So, when you were a kid, you think back to being a kid, did you feel like you watched a lot of movies?
That's a good question. I think I watched an average amount of movies. I think, one interesting thing about the movie-going experience or the experience of watching movies as a kid, and right off the jump, I will belie my age and say that a thing that's interesting for me about the movie experience that I recall from being a kid versus, say, what I see my own children experiencing now is there were fewer options and you were much more constrained by circumstance, by geography, and candidly by your own parents' willingness to indulge you or me in the case in terms of going to movies, renting movies. So I think for my age, for my generation, yes, I think I watched about an average amount of movies as a kid. It wasn't the thing I was most obsessed with, but it was also much more discrete from other things I watched than I think, not to jump ahead in a conversation perhaps, but I think a thing I've noticed with my own kids is that there's a real blurring of the lines about what is a movie versus what isn't a movie these days. And especially when so much for them is consumed in home on a streaming platform that, the only real differentiation point is how long the story is, basically. That is, I think, an interesting thing. So when I was a kid, I think movies were very discrete from and separate from television, say, in a way that I'm not sure they are now.
Would you say that it was also a very big deal to go to a theater versus, say, getting a tape or a DVD or something at home?
A DVD, David, come on.
I know, you weren't fabulously rich.
They didn't exist. I'm old enough that I would not consider myself a kid by the time DVDs were widely available.
Okay.
Maybe a teenager or something like that. Anyhow, yes, going to the theater, going to a movie theater was it was something of an affair. I was somewhat fortunate that near where my mom lived, there was a sort of second run theater called The Crest, which showed, movies that had been out theatrically for some amount of time. And that's often where we would catch any movie, kids or otherwise, because it was cheaper and, wasn't always easy to convince my mom to take my sister and I to a theater for a first run film, with some exceptions, of course. And my flip side, my dad is a big movie lover, but my dad was also, we were much more inclined to watch movies at home, and a lot of movies that we would rent. And my dad was, because he was, kind of styled himself something of a movie lover, was much less indulgent of what my sister and I wanted to watch and much more prescriptive about what we should watch. Let's put it that way.
Oh, okay. So what was the first movie you ever saw in a theater? And now that you mention that, who took you?
So I went with my mom and my sister, and we saw the theatrical release of The Little Mermaid.
And to be clear for younger people who may be listening, we're talking about the animated 1989 Disney movie.
It's the story of Ariel, a beautiful young mermaid who wants to become human.
He's very handsome, isn't he?
I don't know, he looks kind of hairy and slobbery to me.
Not that one, the other one.
And she'll strike a bargain with a powerful sea witch
Have we got a deal?
to make her dream come true.
What I want from you is your voice.
My voice?
You've got it, sweet cakes.
Ariel's been turned into a human.
Have you lost your senses completely?
The human world, it's a mess.
So what was your reaction to that? Like, what do you remember about that?
That's a good question, and I will be upfront and say that was a amount of time ago, and I don't recall super clearly. It's possible that we had gone to some other movie. I'd probably been in a movie theater before that, but I don't really have a memory of it. But I do think one of the things that stood out to me, and I think this is true, was true then and remains true of Disney films, in particular the sort of mainline animated ones, is there is a sense of grandeur to them. They feel significant, and they certainly did then, as I recall, and I did very little research in preparation for this, but I think The Little Mermaid was the first full-length animated feature release for Disney in quite some time. They'd had kind of a long sort of drought, and obviously it kicked off then a string of movies that came out in my childhood of other animated films, Lion King, Aladdin, etc. And so it felt special, even though I at that age was not really able to sort of put it in a broader cultural or historical context, but just getting to go to a theater and have that experience was, very striking.
So do you remember feeling like, you talked a little bit about the experience that children today, you see your children today having with movies. Do you feel like there was a long tail experience with the movie where it kept coming up again and again, because like you weren't going to go back and just watch it again as soon as you wanted to. That wasn't possible. But was it in your culture in a way that, do you remember movies around that time being just in your culture in a way that they are for kids now? They're like, oh, I can see it again. It's just another thing.
Right. And I think about, like, for one example here, moving slightly forward in time, how seemingly all pervasive The Lion King was, again, the original animated release, to be clear, for a number of reasons. It was just a big deal movie, obviously had a very acclaimed cast. The soundtrack was a big deal. Like, my mom bought my sister and I the CD. We played it a lot. Those songs would be played, certainly on like kids radio and maybe even some on mainstream radio. And there were many tie-ins, all those things. Timon and Pumbaa were like cultural touchstones in their own way. And so a movie, there have been movies since that I'm aware of that have had a similar amount of kind of impact on the culture, and that really kind of, I want to say defined culture for a period of time, but were really important, certainly as a kid, but also I think just had more presence. And now I think there are fewer things, maybe there aren't in an absolute sort of in the absolute number of them that have that impact, but there's so much more produced now that relatively few of the movies that are put out have that degree of impact because they are here and people watch them. Maybe a lot of people watch them, but there's something else coming up behind it quite quickly. And, if you were a kid, and certainly even stepping outside of the purview of Disney, there just weren't that many movies that came out that were specifically targeted at kids in any given year. So the one or two that were there that were any good were a big deal. And they remained a big deal for a long time in a way that they don't, both because there are more releases now. And the other piece of this too is the availability of the entire back catalog of lots of these things. So, my kids can go back and watch all of those Disney movies. They can go back and watch lots of other kid movies that in my childhood were only available if you owned the VHS or it happened to be on TV at the time you were watching, or maybe occasionally there was a theatrical re-release of something, but they were not certainly on demand and even just out there. So you were really kind of at the whims of what was, what maybe your family had some, VHS tapes. Mine certainly had a few, or you went to a friend's house and they had it, or, things like that, or you could convince your parents to rent a movie. And again, it's just a very different experience watching a movie these days.
So you're talking about the different experience of consuming culture, movies, music, all of those things. Mm-hmm. When you think back to the first movie that you really loved and would consider your favorite movie, one, what movie was that? And two, how did that express itself for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's like a kids movie answer, and then there's a slightly later, not specifically kids movie answer. So I already mentioned The Lion King, and that's the first movie where I remember going to see The Little Mermaid, but my sister, who is 2 years younger than me, was the one who was really like enamored with that film, as I recall. I didn't dislike it, but just didn't speak to me for whatever set of reasons. But The Lion King was the first movie where I remember like wanting to really like go see it again. I think we saw it twice in theaters, like wanting to get the soundtrack, listening to it a lot, and feeling like, I don't know that I would say, it wasn't like, it didn't necessarily define my personality in any way. I'm not sure any particular thing did, but it was a pretty big deal. And I remember just spending a lot of time kind of, if not watching it actively, sort of, like I said, listening to the soundtrack or things like that.
We are all connected in the great circle of life.
Walt Disney Pictures presents its all-new 30-second full-length animated motion picture, The Lion King. He was born to rule.
This'll all be mine?
Everything the light touches.
But a shadow lies over the kingdom.
I will be king. Run away and never return.
And then a little bit later, and this is, I think, a thing that's also really interesting about kids who watch movies more than kids' movies specifically, was a movie Spaceballs, which is a Mel Brooks parody of mostly Star Wars and lots of other science fiction things. And my sister and I also really love that movie. In fact, that was probably the movie we made our dad rent for us the most, and he would sort of tolerate it because he loved Mel Brooks, even though I think he preferred other Mel Brooks films more. But it was definitely a movie where the first couple times we got it, many of the references were totally unfamiliar. I mean, I think I had probably seen the Star Wars original trilogy at that point, maybe. There are many other movies like Alien that are referenced in that film that I definitely had not seen at that point. But it didn't matter. There was something to me about the fact that it wasn't, in a way, that it wasn't a kid's movie, that it was clearly, at least in large part, aimed at adults, that drew me to it. I mean, this was also the chronology is a little bit vague here. Again, I'm too old to remember these things super clearly, but this was around the time that I got really into like a show like The Simpsons, which I think had, again, a similar dynamic where there were things that kids could appreciate, visual humor, straightforward gags, just all that kind of stuff, the sort of dynamics of the characters. But then there's many allusions and references and just humor that as a kid I absolutely did not catch, and on rewatches as a teenager and adult did start to get more. And I think I'd always certainly from that point on had a certain appreciation for movies that could work on multiple levels like that kids could enjoy earnestly and honestly, but also that had nuance and depth to them, and things that appealed to adults watching it that were very intentionally crafted.
I'm glad you brought up The Simpsons in this context.
I know you are.
Well, I mean, as a Simpsons superfan, true, yeah. but also because I was shocked to discover that, I mean, I shouldn't have been, but I was shocked to discover how many people, just how watched it is on Disney Plus, that kids these days, very young children, watch that show. And part of it is, as you've been talking about, it's there. They have access to all of them. You and I probably grew up in an era where, look, it was in syndication, but if there were 4 episodes on a night, you're at the whim of whatever's there.
Right.
And so I take a look. I watch with my 10-year-old daughter on Disney Plus now, and I am just amazed at what she takes away from it. And I'm just wondering, like, do you think back on your dad's experience watching Spaceballs with you and think to yourself, like, would I have done this? Would I have taken my 10 or so year old child and said, here, we're going to watch this together?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's sort of 2 pieces to that. I think there's the element of, do you as a parent think your kid will, I mean, I don't want to say get it, but like will understand or at least appreciate enough of what's going on to find the film enjoyable. I mean, I will say my older child, my son, is 7, and we recently tried watching Star Wars with him. He's been interested in it conceptually, and he just could not get through it. And, another episode of a different podcast, you can talk about why the beginning of Star Wars is actually kind of weirdly paced and hard for young people to get into because there's not a lot that happens for a while. But fundamentally, it's the kind of thing where I'm sure that my dad was not sort of pulling Spaceballs out of nowhere. I would guess, in thinking back, what it might have been is in the early 90s, I think Robin Hood Men in Tights came out, which is a different Mel Brooks parody film. And I think it was probably after seeing that we probably watched Spaceballs at some point. So there definitely was an element, there is an element to me of like, I haven't rewatched that movie in a long time. Honestly, I will be curious to see, it's kind of like if either of my kids does the Star Wars thing at least a little bit, then it's maybe more interesting to watch it with them, because sort of weird to see a parody film before you've seen the film it's parodying. Obviously it happens, people do that, but it is important. I also think, this a thing I've thought about a lot, and I have no idea if this is what you were getting at, but to me there's also a really important part of parenting around pop culture things more broadly, which is wanting to, on the one hand, create space for my kids to potentially enjoy some things that I or my wife enjoy, but also not feeling like, okay, not being too prescriptive, not saying, here's what you have to watch, here's what you have to read, here's what you have to listen to, etc. Because, I don't think either of my parents were too kind of in my face about that, but I just think it's like, it's not really, I don't really feel strongly about being like, you have to like these things that I like, or you have to appreciate these things that I appreciated, because that's just not kind of my approach to parenting. And so if they don't ever have any interest in watching any of the movies that I reference here, that's fine. Although they have seen The Little Mermaid, so we've already checked that one off the box. I don't think they've seen Lion King, actually, so maybe that's one to put on the list for soon. But yeah, it's not, to me, essential that I share those specific things with my kids, as much as it's just, there's a lot of things that have been come out since that are great, that are work on that same level that we can enjoy together.
So in that thread, what is a kids movie today that you would consider today is your favorite kids movie?
Thinking about this question, I think there's sort of two answers. So for me personally, if you were to say, hey, sit down and watch a kids movie kind of by yourself, I really enjoy Ratatouille.
Ah, Paris, France. Home of the finest restaurants and the greatest chefs in the world. All my life, I've wanted to be one of them. You may think that's a strange dream for a rat, but I've always believed that with hard work and a little luck, it's only a matter of time before I'm discovered.
I mean, again, we're really heavy into like the Disney world here, that they just produce a lot of kids movies, and a lot of kids movies that do work at different levels. But some of this is like my own personal background, having worked in the restaurant industry for a long time and kind of appreciating the gastronomic sensibilities of the film, even though there's a lot of kind of ridiculous, I mean, there's a lot of ridiculous things in the film, period. And even some of the restaurant specific stuff is really kind of not accurate, but that's fine. I enjoy the whole sort of scope and sweep of it, and find in particular Anton Ego to be a like very enjoyable villainous character in a way that like, I don't think a lot of villains in those films have much in the way of interesting arcs. They're kind of mostly just sort of evil or bad or whatever. And Ego actually has kind of an interesting, if somewhat short, arc of character development. Is he
even a villain?
Well, okay, he's presented as the villain for much of the film, or one of the villains for much of the film. And so that's one. I also, to stick with the Pixar thing, I recently rewatched Toy Story and hadn't seen it in quite some time, and was struck by how much more there was in terms of humor aimed at adults watching it than I had recalled. I had sort of known, Pixar again is very well known for doing that with a lot of their films, but it wasn't as clear to me. Like somewhat recently with my kids watched A Bug's Life, which I think came after Toy Story.
Yes.
But was much less of that. I mean, there's definitely jokes that kids don't really get, but it's much more straightforward in its humor, I think, and a lot more kind of, like I said, yeah, straightforward. And Toy Story has a lot more. I mean, there's a lot of things about Toy Story that would not fly now. It was another thing that I caught while I rewatched it, for sure. There are just elements to it that would be done very differently, including, as both my wife and I noted, like Andy's little sister rides in a car seat in the front seat of the car, which is super weird, like jarring to both of us as parents. Like, no, we don't do that. Anyhow, but there's a lot of humor in that film that is really like geared at adults. There's like some innuendo and things like that I don't know if pops up in very many other Pixar films. And so that one, to me, I actually was surprised. I was like, oh, this still really pops in a lot of ways, even if some of their pieces of it where you're kind of here in 2025 a little bit kind of taken aback by the sensibilities of the mid-90s.
Well, you talked about Toy Story. I also had the opportunity to watch it fairly recently. And the thing that I think I thought about while you were talking about its references and innuendo and all that, again, going back to The Simpsons, is that it works on a couple different levels. Like, a kid can watch that and get a vibe of what's going on. Things like The Claw and Pizza Planet and all of those things, they're straightforwardly cartoony sort of stuff. But then you've got the carpeting from The Shining, which is a classic 1970s horror movie. And it's it's definitely no 8-year-old should know what that is, but it's there so that people who are paying close attention, adults will see that and get even more out of it.
Right. And I think one of the hallmarks of a well-made kids movie is that they both, there's lots in there for adults, but also that many of the jokes that are aimed at adults are set up and delivered in a way that even the kids kind of know that they should laugh, even if they don't really know why. I think this is, again, a through line for The Simpsons as well. And then, as you said, there are references and allusions that you don't have to get, whether you're an adult or a kid, you don't have to understand the thing being referenced, but it's like much more of just a little treat for people who do get the reference. It's this moment of like, I recognize that thing. And that just adds a little bit more enjoyment to it without being required to appreciate the sort of main thrust of the story or the jokes or whatever. They're just, little add-ons for folks who do happen to get said reference.
Is there a kids movie that you feel perhaps is a little underlooked in the wider culture that you recommend more people see?
Yeah, I mean, I think here's where we get to this point, or come back to a point that we were making before about how there's just much more content being put out there aimed at kids than there ever have been. I mean, I've certainly experienced this with my kids with streaming TV shows and things like that, where there's just page after page. And, as a parent, you kind of tried, at least for me, kind of try and do a little bit of surveying of what's there and make sure that both content wise and just sort of engagement wise, it's what I want my kids watching. And I would say that a film that had really been not on my radar at all, because it came out in the wide swath of time sort of between when I was a kid and when I had kids, when I didn't see very many kids movies, was Tangled.
Is there anything else I should know about you?
I have magic hair that has to be protected.
From who?
We want the girl with the magic hair.
I have got to get one of these.
I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. I was surprised about how the idea of this sort of retelling of the Rapunzel story, while being, having some different elements, was really kind of fun. And honestly, and this is another thing that I think can be very important in kids movies and sometimes gets more or less lost in them, it's got some great music. I mean, there's some just great songs, very fun, and well put together. And I think those are things that, I'm not sitting here trying to say it's the greatest movie out there, but I was surprised after just sort of having, a very sort of faint understand or like awareness of it because of when it came out in my own age, and being like, oh, this is actually a better movie than I had seen. Whereas I think I had a similar experience with Frozen, but Frozen was such a phenomenon that I was not like, I wonder if people missed Frozen. Like, even I, who did not have kids at that age when it came out, was like aware that it was a phenomenon, and my kids have since seen it and the second movie and really liked it, etc. But there was one where I was like, I knew I had missed it, but I was also aware that it was very highly regarded, and I did not have that sense about Tangled.
I think it's funny that you mentioned Tangled for that reason, because it came right before Frozen, if I recall correctly, and that's part of the reason why it was kind of lost in the broader culture, because such a popular movie came so right on the heels of it. And watching Tangled today, again, when my child was 8 years old, as I think was when we first saw it, I was struck by the immediate opportunity to have the conversation with her, not me forcing it, but her bringing it up, is like, what is up with that mom? Like, what is up with that mom? Like, and it's a complicated question. It's not just that she's evil or that she's bad or something like that. She is a bad person, but it's a little bit there. That's what I think stays with me about that movie, is that all of the main characters have a little bit more than just being their surface level.
Right. And I think that's actually an interesting point, because I think when I think about kind of classic children's movies, and even just fairy tales and things like that they're often based on, you tend to have kind of like a couple of kinds of parents demonstrated. You have sort of your evil stepmom type, who is just, as it says on the surface. And then there's also there's like kind of the there's the parent who's no longer alive, and then there's the like sort of well-meaning but kind of absent parent. I think of like, you know, the Jasmine's dad in Aladdin, or like Ariel's dad in Little Mermaid, who are there. They're not like absent from the story, but they're just kind of like, their cluelessness sort of allows the plot to progress. And you know, understand that if you're going to have a movie where the main character is, you know, not a full-on adult maybe, or at least is kind of has to step out into the world, it's sort of, you kind of often have to have the parents be in one way or another either an obstacle that they have to overcome, or just sort of not fully there in the way that parents often are. But I also think that what's interesting about how Tangled in particular lays this out, and other movies I'm sure do it as well, is there's also an act of discovery for the character that this person who they thought they had one kind of relationship with, they come to see that they actually have a very different kind of relationship with them, a much less healthy relationship than they perhaps thought. And, you know, I don't think it's the case. I think that could be a thing that for some kids, even if they don't get it in the moment, there can be something to be said about like, oh, just because this person is my parent or takes care of me, and, you know, may say they love me and all these things, they may also be doing things that are harmful to me or hurt me, or that are not, you know, they themselves may not be understand what they're doing, but I'm not, like, that's a thing that I can over time come to understand about the dynamic in that relationship that is hard for everyone who has to deal with that in one way or another, whether it's, you know, a parent, another family member, a friend, whomever. You know, there are ways in which we can take away from seeing that modeled on screen that can at least start that sort of internal dialogue about, oh, maybe, you know, maybe this relationship in my life is actually kind of like that, and I need to go beyond it.
I'm fascinated by how you framed that, because it's, as adults, we are adults when we watch a movie. If we watch a movie as an adult, it can be very hard to remember what it was like to be 8 years old and to see this piece of media. To that point, for all of these movies that are primarily directed at children, is there a kids movie that you think that you would recommend many adults see?
Yeah, I mean, again, I have a running theme here or something, but I think Inside Out is a really good example of a movie where I think, in a way, I think adults can come away from that movie with getting a lot more out of it than even kids potentially can.
I'm joy. This is sadness. That's anger. What? This is disgust. And that's fear. We're Riley's emotions. These are Riley's memories. They're mostly happy, you'll notice, not to brag.
I wanted to maybe hold one.
What happened? Sadness?
She did something to the memory.
Is everything okay?
I don't know.
Take it back, Joy.
I'm trying.
Joy, no,
Let
wait.
go.
The core memories.
No.
Inside Out's not a perfect film. I think there are ways in which some of the way the relationship between the various characters that personify emotions is a little, sometimes a little too simplistic, but the ways in which it really does explore, it kind of brings front and center that even relatively young children have complex and complicated emotional lives, and even if they themselves are not super able to understand or articulate what is going on, there is a lot going on there. And I'm sure you, David, saw this with your daughter. I've seen this with both of my children. There is a lot going on there. I think sometimes if you don't have kids, if you're not around them on a regular basis, it's not that people think kids aren't emotional, but I think it's that they think kids are only the big emotions, right? They're only happy, they're only sad, they're only angry, they're only, you know, whatever, grumpy, all these things. And kids are those, and their emotions tend to be big and sort of intense and then fleeting at the same time. But there's also a lot of nuance, and I think that's a thing where the movie does a reasonably good job of capturing that actually a lot of these things are not as straightforward as you would think. And that's a message that's important for kids, of course, even if they don't really fully understand it. But I think for adults who see it, be they parents or not, there is an element in which that message is really important, right? That even if and as in the movie, even if one emotion sort of is piloting the ship or whatever, they're all part of our experience, and many others too. They combine in interesting and important ways, and they're all happening. That's just the reality of human existence.
And the way that it wraps up too, where the parents, if you watch the movie again as an adult or as someone who is very much in touch with Riley throughout the movie and understanding how Riley is growing and changing, I looked at this movie, and I've seen it something like 20 times at this point, and I see the adults and how their emotions are so carefully written to show how they have been made and formed by similar things that clearly happened to them when they were younger.
Right. And that, I think there's that element too of, again, this is a thing as a parent that's a complicated feeling sometimes, but there's a desire certainly that I've had, I imagine you've had, I imagine most parents have had, of, wanting your kids to only have the sort of quote unquote good emotions, right? You don't want them to be sad. You don't want them to be angry. You don't want them to be lonely or upset or any of those things. And obviously, most of us would prefer to mostly be in the world of the happier emotions. But those less happy emotions, the sadness, the loneliness, the anger, etc., they're both a part of life, and so pretending otherwise is not a very good idea. But also, they interact with the more positive emotions in a really interesting way that I think the movie gets at a little bit. It doesn't go too deep into this, but that they inform and help frame the happy feelings, right? It's sort of like if you only ever ate candy, then you wouldn't really appreciate candy. But if candy is the reward you get after you have your dessert, your vegetables or whatever, you can appreciate its sweetness much more than if it was the only thing in your diet. And so I think similarly, the happier emotions, the more positive emotions, the ones we would like to be in, are given their definition by their opposites, or their at least contrasts. And so I think the film does a nice job of sort of highlighting that as well.
Zach, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming and talking with us about these movies and your childhood.
Yeah. My pleasure. It was nice to reminisce a little bit.
My name is David 29 Sunset. This is the Kids Popcorn Podcast. You can find more and subscribe at popcorn.29sunset.com or wherever you get your podcasts.